Please tell me how you came to Ashland.
I moved to Ashland in 1947 because my father and two of my uncles had picked this as a location to start a family business.
What family business did they start?
The name of it was Virginia Automotive and Electrical Appliances. It was on Route 1, not across from the Smoky Pig, a little closer to the intersection of 54 and Route 1.
How old were you at this time?
I was 9.
Mm-hmm. Did you grow up with family business? Do you have any fond memories of that?
Well, no, my only memory of the business was the very unfond one of having worked for my father doing accounting work, which I had no inclination or like for. So as I said, I just ruled that out of any future career for me. Didn't like it at all.
What community or neighborhood did you first live in?
We lived on Railroad Avenue in an old Victorian house. We were renting the upstairs from the woman who owned it, who had lived there all her life, and her name was Miss Lily Rice. She was the aunt of Virginia Sidner Hodges, and it was next door to that house. So it was unlike any other place I'd ever lived. We lived right on the railroad tracks, and the trains kept me awake for the first few nights, but then finally I just didn't hear them anymore. But it was a lesson for me on how people need to learn to live in the future, because there was no air conditioning. The only place I ever knew that had air conditioning places would be department stores and there was someplace else. Department stores and movie theaters were air conditioned. No one had home air conditioning, but houses in the South were built so that they had very high ceilings, the old ones, and the windows went all the way to the floor. So we learned from Miss Lily that if you close the blinds when you wake up in the morning and keep the sun from coming into the house, and keep the windows closed as well, then at night you raise the windows and let the cool air come into the house to relieve the heat, and the house will stay. Well, I don't remember actually whether we lowered from the top, but we definitely raised them from the bottom. And I'd say most of the time we were cool. And also this house has a wonderful porch on the outside that can't remember whether it exactly wraps around. I don't think it did, but it's a very long porch, comfortably furnished, so that you could just sit out there in all kinds of weather, because it was in the shade. Tall shade trees went along with the windows that go to the floor. So it was very pleasant. I don't really remember being uncomfortably hot when I lived here. But we don't do that now. As a society, we build houses in open fields where there are no trees or anything, and the sun just heats them, and so people have to have air conditioning. And I'm not against air conditioning, but we're going to have to make some changes in the way we live.
Who do you think were Ashland's most colorful characters at the time?
Miss Lily was definitely a very colorful character. It took me a while to get to know other people, because I was always the outsider, because I spoke differently. I didn't have the southern accent that people here did. Now people where I live tell me I have a southern accent, but I don't talk like people in the Richmond area, and didn't then. But people were very welcoming. You know, they treated me nicely. But my parents didn't fit in. They weren't from here. And I discovered something about living in the South, which is that you either belong or you don't. If you're an outsider, it takes a very long time to be accepted by the people who are already here, because their shared knowledge of the past, including the Civil War, is what binds them together. And my father worked such long hours trying to get the business started. He was seldom at home. My mother seldom ventured from the house. She She was very introverted and something of a recluse. And I just thought that she was odd. And it wasn't until she was 70 and came to our house and never left. She was like the man who came to dinner, you know, the play. He comes and he breaks his leg and he stays. She came at the age of 70 and had a small stroke. She came to visit because our son was graduating from high school and she wanted to go to the ceremony. But she had a very small stroke and we didn't understand what had happened to her. So I took her to doctors, a neurologist and others, to try to find out what the problem was, and we discovered it was a stroke. But it wasn't until then that she was diagnosed as having clinical depression. That was a term that didn't even exist in my youth. But she had been depressed her entire adult life, really. I'd say I can remember her being a little different when I was like 3 or 4, but after that she was very strange. So she didn't go out, which meant she didn't make friends in the neighborhood. And my father was too busy to do social things with other guys, so I just made my own friends, and I had school because we moved during the school year. It had just started, I guess. So my world was my friends and my teachers, and then my universe began to expand.
Which school did you attend?
Henry Clay High School, which the building isn't even there any longer. And I guess there's a consolidated school now out on 54. It's Patrick Henry. In fact, my husband's brother, no, he was in the last graduating class at Henry Clay, wasn't he? He graduated the year that you and I were married. But then my cousin finished at Patrick Henry after it opened.
What did you like and dislike most about school?
I loved everything about school. I really did. I just lived for school because it got me out of the house. It was a place for me to be all day. And I had lots of friends, and I got along well with my teachers. They all seemed to like me, and many of them, I think, gave extra effort to teaching me because it paid off. You know, I learned quickly and got good grades, so school was where I thrived.
What were your favorite classes?
I liked almost everything. I wasn't wild about math, but it wasn't all that hard either. I'd say if I struggled with anything, it was physics. But Jim was in the same class with me, so I managed to get through with a little tutoring.
In what ways has having the college influenced your life?
It has changed my entire life. It began when I found that I had friends who were children of faculty members at Randolph-Macon. The first one was Ginger Mabry. We became friends right away, and her father was the dean of students. Another student in my class was Joe Haley, whose father was Dr. Haley, professor of Greek. Then, not in my class, but in Jim's class, we had a friend who was John Packard. His father was a biology professor, and his older sister, Harriet, was in high school with us, but she was a year ahead of you. 3 years? 2 or 3. So they began inviting me to their homes, which I quickly was glad to do, quickly agreed. And that just opened up a whole new world for me. Dr. Mabry and his wife were just very nice people, very kind and gentle. And they used to invite students into their home for dinner. So sometimes if he had invited a couple of students to come over, just for dinner table conversation, it wasn't any kind of working situation for them. But I do remember well. I even remember the names of some of the students I met there. But that was very intellectually stimulating, and then Mrs. Mabry would allow Ginger to invite me. So that was great fun. You know, there'd be maybe 6 of us for dinner, and we did that a number of times. also, as a result, because they invited me to attend church with them. My parents didn't attend church. They were Methodists, but they hadn't resumed attending since moving, for the reasons already stated. And the Mabrys invited me to go to church with them. They thought I would enjoy going to Duncan Memorial and maybe getting involved in a Sunday school class. So I said, yes, I'd like to do that. And I began attending the church. And then our music teacher, this was later, but once I was already at the church and was baptized there and joined the church when I was 12, our music teacher in high school, who was also the Glee Club director for the college, his name's Bill Troxell, and he invited me and Ginger and a couple of other girls in our high school to sing in the church choir, because he was also directing that, so I did that. And there were Randolph-Macon students in the choir as well. So Randolph-Macon just expanded my entire universe while I was in high school. In addition to singing in the church choir, Bill Troxell also produced operettas, Gilbert and Sullivan and Strauss operettas, and we were involved in those. But he became the pivotal person because he was connected to both Randolph-Macon and the high school and the church. I mean, as I was going through all of this in my head, I finally drew what to me was a diagram of my early life. It's a triangle. The town, the church, town including the high school, the church, and the college. And the person in the middle, connected to all of those things, is Bill Troxell. So we did those, and I also joined a Sunday school class. The teacher was Carl Baskin, professor of economics. And I was in some plays at Randolph-Macon while I was in high school, because Jim and I did a lot of drama in high school. Not personal drama, but you know, theatrics. And of course, they didn't have any girls to play the female parts. So I was in a lot of those plays, and one of them was The Man Who Came to Dinner. So I was Sheridan Whiteside's secretary. And so also went to football games at Randolph-Macon with Ginger and other friends. Went to the bonfires that they used to have before the homecoming games. Went to concerts at Randolph-Macon. I was telling Jim today that as a high school student, I can remember learning that Randolph-Macon was going to host a concert for the Juilliard String Quartet for the college and the community, and I couldn't believe it. So I was there with bells on. I wasn't going to miss that, because I'm not talented in music, but I have always loved music, classical music and opera from childhood. So I got over to Blackwell early to make sure that I would get a seat, and I couldn't believe it. The auditorium wasn't even full. All these people were missing that wonderful opportunity. So, that was educational for me. And the library. If it were not for Randolph-Macon, no one in Ashland during the time I was living here would have had access to a library. So I spent many of my afternoons from the time I moved here. When I discovered that, I guess again I learned this probably from Ginger Mabry, if you lived in the town, you could use the library. So I was over there every afternoon after school. I read my way through the entire children's library. I was so happy when I was there. And so obviously a lot of my education came from Randolph-Macon. I didn't have to pay any tuition. Also, we had a youth group. It was called the Ashland Youth Fellowship, and it was sponsored, I guess, jointly by all the churches in Ashland. It wasn't as we have, because we belong to a large Methodist church in Arlington. It wasn't just exclusively Methodist. But all of our friends came to that, regardless of what church they attended. And the people who provided the adult leadership were Randolph-Macon students.
Or couples.
Or couples, right. They were pre-ministerial students. So this, I guess, was part of their education, a kind of internship, maybe. So all of those things were opened up to me by the fact that Randolph-Macon was in this town. As I think back on the people I knew at Randolph-Macon who were so important to me, besides Dean Mabry and Bill Troxell, Carl Baskin and his wife Beth and their children, because he was my Sunday school teacher, and I can remember they had a youth group meeting on the farm where they lived, and we all got to go out there and spend the day with them. I knew Dr. Moreland and his family from church, and then that just expanded. His daughters were quite a bit older than I was. I mean, not 10 or 15 years, I don't think, but the difference between high school and college is, a major difference. So I never went to school here with any of them, but I knew them all. And Dr. Frank Day, for whom Dayfield is named, just took a personal interest in me. I was very fond of him.
I thought he was going to adopt you. He really was fond of you.
And then Dr. Haley, because I knew his son Joe, and they invited us to their home. And then I sort of had an indirect or one step removed relationship with Professor Martin, because his wife taught me French in high school, and I knew John Longacre, who was the professor of art here, through Ashland Little Theater, because I appeared in some plays that they put on, and Neil Oliver, who was George Brown Oliver's wife, was our Latin teacher, and the Packards, I've already said, invited us into their home because we knew the kids, and then Jim was his student, so that was a very long relationship. Hugh Stevens, baseball coach and athletic director, and his wife Catherine were our friends as well. Church and college were the connection there, and T. McNider Simpson, who was, I can't remember what his position was.
Treasurer.
I was going to say he wasn't faculty. He was the treasurer, wasn't he? I think so. So knew him and his sons, and Lambeth Clark, who was assistant to the president here, and then went on to help open. Well, he wasn't the first. He wasn't there. He was the second president of the new Methodist College, Virginia Wesleyan in Norfolk.
Virginia Beach.
Is it Virginia Beach? I thought it was over the line in Norfolk.
Virginia Beach.
Okay.
Just over the line.
And Gertie Sloan, I knew from church, and she was the alumni director, just a delightful woman. And then she was succeeded by Roddy Jones, who I also knew through church. And
one you may be planning to mention, very dear to us. Of course, you were going to mention a lot of the ministers at Duncan Memorial, but Harris Kessler in particular.
Yeah, well, I knew all of the college chaplains because they also served as pastor of Duncan Memorial, and I had very special relationships with some of them. One was Bob Parker, because he was the pastor who baptized me, and it was my first real Methodist pastor. And then Jim mentions Harris Kessler, who was also in the same position, and he married us. And we got to see him as recently as last, was it
About
last?
a month before he died.
But was that this year? It was. Or was it
so.
last year?
I'm not sure.
But anyway, we thought I mean, he never changed. We'd been married 50 years. We're turning gray and getting wrinkled, and every time I saw Harris Kessler, he looked exactly the same as the last time I
And
saw
he would
him.
say to us, I did a good job,
Yes,
didn't I?
every time we saw him, he said the same thing, because I would always say to him, Harris, we are still married. And he would say to me, I tied that knot tight, didn't I? Such a delightful man. And then we also were friends with Schuyler and Margaret Miller. He was the geology professor.
And chemistry.
I didn't realize he taught chemistry as well, because they had kids younger than we were in the school. We went
But
to
we
high school.
overlapped in school a little bit.
Mm-hmm. And then when we graduated, Jim and Margaret Miller used to carpool together to
Along with
Manchester High School,
Troxel.
along with Bill Trucks
And his wife.
and his wife, yes. And then I remember fondly Dr. and Mrs. Pannell. I didn't have quite the same personal relationship with them, just for lack of opportunity, really. And then an alumnus who was also a townsperson, but was a college staff person, was Ed Cox, who was so kind to us in our family when our son was applying to colleges, and Randolph-Macon was one of the ones he applied to, and he ultimately decided to go to UVA because that was a decision we had placed completely in his hands. We said we'd be pleased to have him go to any of the 5 that he had applied to and was accepted by. And Ed was very sorry to lose him, because they were clearly trying to recruit applicants with the kind of credentials our son had. And he had been here for soccer camp, I remember,
Yeah.
when he was playing in high school, and you were the coach. And so he knew the college, he'd seen it, and he had nothing against it, but he just knew his heart was in Charlottesville, and he finished there. So that's a lot.
Mm-hmm. Did you have any friends that attended the college?
Yes. I sort of divided the college people I knew into 3 groups, faculty and staff, because I knew many of them for so long and I knew them so well. Jim knew them most, or some of them, from the time he entered, although he certainly knew the Packards and some of the others prior to that.
But her connection to the college is
It began when I was
much
9.
longer and, in one sense, much deeper.
Yes.
Because it was, maybe if I lived 5 miles out of town, so.
It doesn't sound like far, but it is far, because I was close enough to the college to walk over here. I walked over probably every day almost to either meet Ginger and do something with her, or go to the library, or later, when I was in high school and college, I can remember going to the library here over Thanksgiving and Christmas break to work on research for papers I was writing at Longwood. But in addition, there were my town friends who happened also to be alumni. Dick Gillis, Tom Bass, Ned Stiles. I mean, these are people who are all older than I was, but when you live in a small town, you know everyone. That's one of the nice things about living in a small town. You don't just have a universe that is made up of your peers and your fellow students. P.K. Perrin and Eloise Piccolo. We patronized her husband's drugstore.
You knew her, but you were very young, very young.
Yes, when I was a child. And then Hugh Campbell and Judd Vaughn and Pete Turner, who was a classmate of mine. I mean, this is not an inclusive list at all. These are just the names that came up. So that was the second group of Randolph-Macon people I knew. And then the third group begins with the people Jim actually went to school with after he entered here in '53. And these people are still our lifelong friends. So, and then because I've done a lot of volunteer work for the Methodist Church, my husband calls me Church Lady. You remember Saturday Night Live? And it's true that I'd say out of a typical 7-day week, I'm probably there 1 full day and at least probably 3 to 4 other days in and out doing things. And so I served on some district committees, and I was a delegate to annual conference. So I remember fondly people like Purnell Bailey, Franklin Gillis, and all the ministers who have ever served the churches
Mariner,
that
who's
we've
around
all.
up Nickel
Kirk
Creek.
Mariner, that's right. Oh, how could I fail to mention Kirk? He is
He's
so
a close
dear to
friend.
us. So,
Bergdahl, Clark,
yeah.
Herb Hobbs.
So I feel as if, in fact, I have said, sometimes when you're in a church setting and getting to know a group of people with whom maybe you're having a class or a small group discussion, if you don't all know each other, and in a church as large as ours you probably don't, it may begin with the group leader saying to you something like, well, tell us something about your spiritual journey. Where did it begin and how has it progressed since then? And very often I say to people, I can sum it up very quickly. I was raised by Randolph-Macon College and the Methodist Church. It's true.
Yeah. One thing Anita hasn't mentioned, and I shouldn't say angers her. She doesn't like me to talk about it, therefore I don't, but I think this is important. And I'm not leading up to a joke or anything, because it's part of the history of this town. She was the first Miss Hanover who went on. Dick Gillies crowned her right here on Dayfield, and she won it on her seamstress or sewing skills. Now she goes, but she went on and was and she was the first of, and I guess they still have Miss Hanovers, or
I have no
she was
idea.
called Miss Hangover, just as a joke. There's no reason for it other than it was similar to Hanover. And then she
Somebody
went on
on the
to
parade route did that.
A college
I
boy
beg
did that.
your pardon.
Someone on the parade route, when
That's
we were
right.
riding down.
And
the
she went on to the
convertibles.
tobacco festival, which we had back then, as one of the princesses. And Dick Gillis worked it out so I could be her escort. It was
And I
fun.
could have gone on to compete in the Miss Virginia pageant, but I didn't want to. I
No.
just wasn't interested in things like that. And the only reason that I did the Miss Hanover contest was that I did it as a favor to a friend. Because people in Ashland sponsored girls to enter that. But it wasn't as if there was there was no scholarship money
No.
attached. It was just the honor of it. But I had a teacher who was very dear to me in high school. Her name was Ivy Cross.
Mhm.
And her husband and his family owned and operated Cross Brothers grocery store on Railroad Avenue. And they wanted to sponsor someone. And she approached me and said they would like to sponsor me.
Yeah, I
There's
forgot.
no way in the world I could have ever said no to her.
But I think the biggest, and you probably agree, the biggest value you got out of that was using and honing your, not that it was theatrical, but speaking before people, presenting your materials, what you'd done, and just having presence and ease among people.
Well, like any life experience, you learn
Yeah.
something from it. And so it was fine. I'm not saying that it was an unpleasant experience. It wasn't. We had a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And there was scholarship money attached to that, which was one reason, the other reason, but definitely the secondary reason why I was willing to do that.
Through the festival.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
But I don't mention it much.
But I
I've
saw
been
enough
slapped
of
so
the-
many times.
I saw enough of the inside of what goes on in those competitions that I knew I didn't ever want to do it
Yeah.
again. Because it's not anything that's based on merit. I've competed in a lot of situations where it was your merit. On your merit you would succeed or fail. That's fine. But it's not merit in those situations.
Yeah.
It's a lot of other things that don't interest me.
Thank you for not throwing the book at me.
But I've never said anything to anyone about it. And just recently, I was in the kitchen doing something or the dining room, and I saw you out in the living room with this book of pictures and stuff, and you were telling Meredith and Mike about all this, and I just stayed out. I didn't even want to go in there.
We don't have any pictures of.
Well, there was a picture of the crowning ceremony here, and I heard you talking to
I
him
think
about it.
you dreamed that.
Could be.
We'll have
So-
to try to find one.
No, I know exactly where I have hidden it. So anyway, preparing to come here today was a very useful experience for me.
Both of us, I think.
Yeah, we had lunch yesterday and we
You're
talked
much
about
better
it. And
prepared
made
than I
some
am. I just wung it, so to speak.
Is that the past tense of wing? I don't
Wing,
think
wang,
so.
wang.
I don't think so. But it made me see in a global way what I always knew, that Randolph-Macon is really important to me. And I said to Jim on the way down, I would have been a different person without Randolph-Macon in my life. Thanks, Sarah. Enjoyed lunch.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Enjoyed it.
Have you seen any major changes on the campus?
Oh, lots. It was much smaller when I came here. I just remember the old chapel, which was where I went to church and Sunday school, Wash Hall, which had not yet been restored, and Mary Branch and Thomas Branch, the chemistry building and the biology building, Vet
Library.
Village, the fraternity houses,
The old library. Or did you mention that?
Walter Hines Page.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, I certainly remember that very well.
And the old gym.
And the old gym. And also I remember Alumni Gym, because to say that I played basketball in high school would certainly be stretching it a lot. But I was on the team, so we practiced there. And I guess we played games there.
Mhm.
And I came to, you and I used to come to all the college basketball games, and we came to all the home football games. We even went to some of the ones that were away when your brother was playing.
Yeah.
So, yes, and you know what I thought about today after I finished making all my notes? You and I learned ballroom dancing from a married couple who lived in Vet Village. He was a Randolph-Macon student. And they decided to just do a ballroom dancing class. I don't even remember where we danced. I don't think it could have been in their little unit. It was too
I don't
small.
remember who it was.
I would recall the names if I heard them,
Mhm.
but I couldn't tell you who they were. But nice people.
Yeah.
Busy people. I mean, he was a full-time student, and I think they had a couple of kids, and they were willing to just put themselves out to do that. And then later, I remember we took a commercial class in ballroom dancing in Richmond.
Arthur Murray.
Arthur Murray. Not himself, but it was his dancing school. So what else do you have?
What was student life back then? Like back then?
In high school,
Mhm.
for me, it was very segregated, which troubled me, because I was not a Southerner. I came from West Virginia, and ironically, I moved north to move to Ashland, because although I lived in West Virginia, it was in the southern tip of it, which was not very far really from Roanoke. It was just across the state line from Roanoke. And I remember that's how we got here, because our first trip we made, I guess, was before we actually moved, just came to visit it and stay with my aunt and uncle who lived in Richmond, and we came through Roanoke on the train. And that was probably, since World War II was over and we were at peace, that was probably the single biggest national debate, because in my junior year of high school, that was when the Supreme Court delivered its decision on Brown versus the Board of Education. And so there was just this feeling of tension and stress, not just throughout Virginia, but throughout the South, about how the South was going to deal with this, because Southerners as a group seemed to be greatly opposed to the decision. They didn't like it, but it was very hard to argue that it was wrong based on the liberties that are guaranteed to us through the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. But I was very glad to hear it, and I was in favor of it. I didn't know anyone else who lived around here who was, so I didn't say a whole lot. And then, as luck would have it, because I went to college at Longwood, I was in Prince George's County, Prince Edward County, right, when they closed the public schools under Harry Byrd's massive resistance effort, closed the public schools.
Well, he wasn't governor then. I mean, he was high, he was in the Senate, but
Senator.
he was governor.
But
governor.
it might have been Almond who was
Almond.
governor, but Harry Byrd
Well, he
ran
backed it,
politics
I'm
in
sure he backed
Virginia.
it.
It didn't matter who was governor. And so he mounted this massive resistance effort, and the schools I was in the last group of Longwood students to do practice teaching in the Prince Edward County schools, because even the college thought it wouldn't be safe to send young ladies into integrated public schools where there might be savages there. I mean, they didn't say that, but that's the feeling that I got. So I completed my student teaching the second semester of my junior year. Then I went back, and I had one semester left to do before I graduated in January of the next year. But that was a very sad day because the public schools here were closed as well. And then they reopened as private academies.
That's true. Hanover Academy
is.
grew out of it.
That
But
is.
the schools here were never closed, public schools, in Hanover and in Ashland. But the private school, Hanover Academy for one, was formed in response to the court ruling. I think
Yes.
I'm right there.
But did they actually use separate buildings?
What do you mean?
Well, white students were not going to Henry Clay High School.
Yes, they were.
Were they?
Yes.
But no, black students were
Right.
going. So it was still segregated. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, but you said
because
schools
your brother
were closed. They weren't. They didn't close.
There were a few days apparently that they did
They
close till
closed
they
them.
figured
Yeah.
out what to do, but
That
not
may
for
be, yeah.
extensive amounts of time.
So that was a very sad time, I think. A real blot on Virginia's history when you consider all the great things that the state gets credit for in helping to found the nation. And it was a very bleak time.
Can I interject something?
Mhm.
Sure.
Something that I was born here in Hanover and raised here, and I grew up with both sides of my family very Southern. Both sides of my family had either direct or secondary remembrances of the Civil War, believe it or not. My great-grandfather was living then, and I knew him. I remember him. So the feelings on the race issue ran very deep in these people. And I think my generation and my cousins on both sides were the first, at least in our neighborhood, to start coming out of this mindset. I remember talking to black friends of mine, or back then they were colored friends. If I'd called them black, I would have been in trouble because I was disrespectful. But talking, boy, if we could go to school together, we could have one heck of a football team. It wasn't that we could really have a good math class, but it was, we kind of sympathized. And so I think with our generation, and I'm not saying everyone in my generation, because I knew some friends, you didn't discuss the subject because they had their muskets and all ready to go again.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of my friends, and my family in particular, that's when we started turning the curve, I think.
Oh, it took a long time, of
Oh, it
course.
did.
I'm
And
not-
it's still happening.
I'm not criticizing people in general.
I know.
I'm saying that the leadership of Virginia
Oh,
really
absolutely.
let its
Yeah, I
citizens
wasn't criticizing.
down.
What you said is absolutely right. But I'm just glad to see that at least in my lifetime, and in our children, it's turned, Civil War. What do you mean
It's
you
because
can't
of where
go to
we
school
live.
with such and such? It's foreign to them.
Well, one of the first conclusions I drew from moving here was that the Civil War would never end in Richmond. Never.
You mean the wall?
I'm sorry, the wall,
The
yes.
Of northern aggression.
No,
And
well,
so,
yeah,
right.
absolutely.
And so while I enjoyed living here and people treated me very well, I couldn't say a critical thing in the world about how I was treated. I was very troubled by what I saw as mixed signals. People calling themselves Christians, going to church every Sunday, giving to the church, serving the church, had no problem whatsoever in denying black children a quality education. So it was very troubling for me. And that's one of the reasons why, as I pursued my career, I really focused on positive efforts, because fighting doesn't get you anywhere, but positive efforts in helping women and minorities achieve equal opportunity, working for fair employment practices, doing diversity training. I was vice president. I retired as vice president for employee relations at the Nature Conservancy, which is the largest conservation organization in the world, and one of the most successful, not only in terms of its programmatic achievements, but also successful in fundraising. Nobody knows how to do it better than the Nature Conservancy. So that's what my work was all about, and I also was appointed by the Arlington County Board to chair the Civil Service Commission, which is the final arbiter of employee disputes. And of course some of them had to do with fair employment practices. But Arlington is far more liberal politically than this part of the state. So we were able to achieve more there, and the public schools there were integrated with very little stress. It went very smoothly, and there are good relations in Arlington among all citizens. Arlington is a highly diverse community.
Some parts of it, if you got on the street, you would think you were in a foreign country.
Well, I have been many times in situations in Arlington where I was the only white person present. I have ridden buses to work and been the only white person on it. But it isn't black-white the way it is in Alabama or Louisiana. I did eventually develop an understanding for what it was like to live down there, because we went down there for a wedding soon after we were married, and I could sense that many of the communities there, the majority of the people are black. The white minority was very nervous about how things were going to change as a result of the Supreme Court decision. But in Arlington, to give you an idea of our diversity, and it is so incredibly peaceful. People get along and respect one another and work together and learn from one another. We have one elementary school in Arlington, and it's not even a big school, where there are 80 different languages spoken by the children.
Yep.
So it's a pretty amazing situation.
Our
So
ancestors would be shaking their heads. I don't mean in opposition, but in
A
disbelief.
lot of them would be in opposition, I'm sure of that.
Well, some.
But that is my proudest achievement as a professional, to have been part of that.
Well, I experienced that too as a teacher.
Yes, I know you have.
But
And a coach.
there's one more thing which I find sad but humorous too. Miss Lily Rice remembers seeing Lincoln come through Ashland on a train. You know what you told me?
Right after Richmond was burned,
Yeah.
he came through
And
to
we
make a
had
speech.
a 7th grade English teacher whose father was a doctor in the Civil War. Now just think about that. I mean, here we are 70-ish, but in time we knew people that lived 150 years ago.
Right. There were lots of Civil War veterans
Oh,
still
yeah.
living when we were
And
in
some,
high
in
school.
fact, I have a picture at home of me sitting on the lap of a former slave. But back to Miss Mary, her father was a doctor in the Civil War, and she was called a teacher. I'm not sure how much English we learned. She was a nice
I
lady.
never learned anything from her except her negative attitudes
Yeah.
and her
One day
hatred
she
toward
told
Northerners.
us, children, and she would talk about Civil War. Children, I was a
Endlessly.
grown woman before I realized that damn Yankee was 2 words. So that was some of the prevailing attitudes back when we were children.
Mm-hmm.
And it's slowly, time is the only thing that's going to take care of a lot of this, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. So anyway, I feel as if I owe a debt to Randolph Macon that I will never repay.
What do you think the future holds for the college?
I think the college has a very bright future. Partly because the alumni are so deeply attached to the college. I graduated from Longwood College 50 years ago. I've been back 3 times. Once I went back soon after we were married when I decided to give up teaching. I'd started it and I found it pretty quickly. It really wasn't for me, not in public schools anyway. But I went back to seek the counsel of a couple of the professors I had studied under in the English department about next steps, because I really wasn't sure. I didn't want to. I wanted to leave the position at the logical time, but I had not done a job search for anything else. So I talked to them, and they had warned me against teaching to begin with. So naturally, they were the people I went back to say, well, you're right, it didn't work. Now let's talk about phase 2. I think they knew that I would be enormously frustrated. I intended to teach and quit after, well, I taught from January to June in an elementary school, which was great fun. I didn't want to keep it up, but it was so much fun. We got married in April of that year, and we invited all the students to the wedding. So we have a wedding picture of us coming out of Duncan Memorial in our wedding clothes, surrounded by 10-year-old 5th graders. That was so much fun. But I didn't want to continue doing that. I didn't know anything about teaching elementary school. So then I taught summer school there, because you had to go away to that place in Pennsylvania for summer camp. So I taught summer school there. Believe it or not, I taught summer school math. And then, we moved to Alexandria. Well, to Arlington, but I taught in Alexandria. That's right, at George Washington High School, which had the reputation of being one of the finest high schools in the state. And they were so eager to hire me. They hired me sight unseen on my record from Longwood, hired me over the phone. And so I accepted the position and went up there. I had no idea. I had students who couldn't read in high school English. There was nothing I could do to help those students.
A couple of them a year older than you.
Yeah, they never knew it. But I was 20, and I had a student who was 21 who couldn't read anything. And he wasn't mentally disabled. He was intelligent. And the other boy who couldn't read was intelligent as well. And their families were very supportive and encouraging, but they didn't know what to do to help children who couldn't read. So I thought, well, maybe I could succeed if I left this job and went to graduate school and got a master's in special education with a specialty in reading. So I did that, but in order to do it, I went to work for American University, which is, as you know, a Methodist-related university, as Randolph-Macon is. And free tuition was a benefit of employment. So I went to school part-time at night while I worked during the day. So it took me, I guess, 3 or 3.5 years to get my master's degree. And by the time I did it, I finished it. And yes, I did learn. I figured out what was probably wrong with the kids who couldn't read. Dyslexia, which was a new word in our vocabulary back then. And the thing was, by the time I got the master's degree, I was enjoying working for the university so much and feeling so intellectually stimulated and challenged by that job, I didn't want to leave it. So then a time came that I left the university, and before leaving I did at least interview with the person in charge of reading in Arlington County. And he was interested in hiring me for a job, and I asked him a few questions about what was entailed, and I figured out that what they were planning to do was to take all the kids who were troublemakers out of their academic classes and put them in a special reading class on the assumption that they had reading problems, which was why they weren't behaving in class, couldn't pay attention. And I thought, oh no, I'm not going there. So I did something else.
Job, she got her master's, and I had finished mine at Virginia, but had started taking. In fact, got into the doctoral program at AU. I think I got 30 or 40 hours into it.
And that was free too.
And I lost my counselor.
Your advisor retired.
And the new one wanted me to take about 30 more hours, and I said, no, thank you.
He said, Mr. Allen, I have a whole different vision for you and your future in school supervision and administration. Joseph, see ya. He didn't
But
need
I
it.
had started to mend a little bit from my undergraduate sins. So that was a good experience.
Are you out of questions?
No.
Okay.
Do you have any questions, Laurie?
Not right now.
Okay. What about college student involvement in the town at Randolph-Macon?
I certainly saw some, and I've already referred to some of it as being the connection between the church and the college, because you really can't tweeze them apart. Couldn't when I was here, because the most active and faithful lay people in Duncan Memorial, by and large, were college people and their families. And then also the fact that some of our teachers in the high school and in elementary school, Carol Howerton taught 6th grade, I think, while Sig was here studying and playing football. And so I didn't see any of what I would call the typical town and gown rivalries or distrust or any of the negative aspects. I only saw the positive. I'm trying to think what else. Well, the other thing that had a lot to do with it was the fact that so many Randolph-Macon alumni had either grown up here before going to college here, or they had settled here after finishing college, like Tom Bass, because they liked it so much, and he married a local girl, so he wasn't going anywhere. So people like Dick Gillis, Tom Bass, Jay Pace, not that we knew him in college, he came along after we left Ashland, but because we read the Herald Progress, he provided us with a way to keep current with what was going on in Ashland through his newspaper, which was a very fine newspaper, even though it was a small one. And now it has gone down so badly, it's hardly even worth reading. So people like that who were alumni of the college were in positions of leadership in the town. Linwood Atkinson, a friend of ours from high school, he never finished college here because his dad owned a major business outside town, And I don't know whether he needed Linwood there because maybe his health wasn't good. But Linwood left college and went full-time into the business. But he and people like Hugh Campbell, Judd Vaughn, Pete Turner, all local attorneys, were... Oh, yes, Nelson Taylor. He was the principal at our high school. And so many of the town's leaders happened to be Randolph-Macon graduates. So you just didn't see any of this pushing and shoving going on that can go on in some localities. I can't remember ever hearing a negative word said about Randolph-Macon by anyone in Ashland. Absolutely never. And I think that's a tribute to the college for doing it right. And that was my final step. First I went through all my memories and kind of cataloged them, and I put those notes away. But as I thought about what is it that the college did right, you know, if you were just opening a college right here in Ashland today, and you asked someone for advice in the town on how can we make this work, I'd say, well, first of all, you have to earn the respect and the confidence and the trust of the people who live here, so they don't see you as some kind of rival. So how do you do that? Well, you provide jobs for the people who live here, because the college is going to need to hire not just faculty, but staff and groundskeepers and, you know, accountants and all kinds of people. So you provide them with employment, and for a long time Randolph-Macon has been the #1 employer in Ashland. And you involve them. You invite them to come to the campus. So you might have an event on the campus like the Strawberry Fair. Get everybody to come and see the campus and see what you have to offer. And you might invite kids from the local community to come over to learn a little more about higher education and what Randolph-Macon has to offer. And then you might turn it around and you might send some of your students into the public schools to mentor students who may need a little extra help. And we do that, well, I'm not doing it right now, but I did it for years in Arlington because we have so many immigrant families. Kids come into the public schools, they don't speak any English, and their parents don't speak any English either. So even after the kids start speaking English, if they need help with their homework, there's no one at home who can help them. So I used to go 1 day a week to a public school in a very diverse neighborhood, and I would tutor kids in reading and help them pronounce the words correctly. And I'd read to them and get them to read to me. And it was amazing the progress these kids made. I remember 2 little Guatemalan brothers came there. School had already started. They didn't speak a word of English when they arrived. Within 4 weeks, they were speaking English fluently. And as a foreign language teacher, I know that your brain is wired to learn language when you are very young. That's how you learn to speak your native language. The older you get, the harder it is. College is too late for people to be trying to learn a foreign language. It's going to be so much harder. So these kids were very receptive and very motivated to learning English. So it was wonderful to see such quick results to your efforts. So Randolph-Macon could send some, with college program, they could send people into public schools to go over there after school and spend a couple of hours working with kids who are struggling, for whom learning isn't easy. And this could succeed in creating a bond between the community and the college. That's what I would say to somebody just starting up. Jim has a cousin who lives in Richmond, and they live near the University of Richmond. They're retired too, moved here from California. And University of Richmond has some kind of program there where for a modest fee, you can be a part of some community program that gives you access to activities at the university, guest speakers, programs, discussion groups, book groups, whatever. And the university provides the space, and if there's a speaker, they bring the speaker in, and they can even audit classes. Now, I got my master's at AU. I can go over there and audit a class in anything. And I've never taken advantage of it because I really haven't had the time for it. But I can see how doing something like that could really create a bond. Because one thing we know that made race relations difficult and can make relations between Americans and people that we may tend to distrust, like Muslims, different, is if somebody speaks up, an American, and says to you, well, I don't know about those Muslims. I mean, they've attacked us once. I don't think we can trust them. Somebody else might say, yeah, that was an awful experience. I'll never forget it. But you know what? I have a friend who's a Muslim. There's nothing different between the two of us. We get along. You always know people in a group that you like and trust, and therefore you aren't willing to buy into the gossip or the prejudice that other people are trying to promote. So whenever you bring people together who may not be sure that they trust each other, by getting to know each other, they decide, hey, those college people are all right. I thought they'd be stuck up because of all those PhDs. Nicest people I ever met. So I think things like that can go a long way. And yeah, those were all of the things that I thought about that can make things better in situations like this. But it seems to me the college is already doing everything right.
Mm-hmm.
Are you aware here of tensions or strained relations between
There's
college
been
and
some division over time. The president certainly is very interested in community relations, and I think that a lot of great ties are being made now, and in a very
Good.
positive ways. So I think for the future that the communication's going to reopen. I think it's had some difficult times, but it's coming back in a good way.
Talking
Good.
about this the last couple of days as we looked today. I told her as a child, and I'm talking about elementary age, I couldn't give you a list, but I just felt from hearing relatives, friends talk that there was some kind of little rubbing or friction in a certain area between the community and the college. Maybe it was just my immaturity or misunderstanding back then.
well, it's
But-
more often that way than not.
Yeah. But today, I don't detect any of that. If it did exist then, I don't detect
Now, there
that.
might have been that time when some of your fraternity brothers, after you were gone, went to the laundromat and did their laundry in the nude. That might have strained relations.
I don't remember either.
We
I
haven't
rem-
heard that one.
I remember reading about it in the Herald
It wasn't
Progress.
my fraternity. Don't you mention my fraternity.
It was your fraternity. I think it was.
Never do that. Brothers in the bond, never do that.
Well,
I could be mistaken. It does
I know
sound
they-
more like something Kappa Sigs would do, doesn't it?
I do know that they did get themselves in trouble and got the charter pulled on those Fidels.
Yeah, but that was
Some years
later.
ago. And they earned having it pulled from them.
Goodness.
But when Jim was here, the Fidels were known for being the most academically, the best academic performers as a
But
fraternity.
we won the national award among
Mhm.
all the Fidel chapters, and I thought it was so funny. I was a member of it.
Well, you clearly brought the average down. But
Well, you can have like to say that. But, all fraternities and sororities have their ups and downs, I'm sure. That's part of getting educated and growing up and
Yeah.
becoming
It
normal
is.
like the rest of us.
When you moved here, Interstate 95 was not open.
Oh, absolutely
How
not.
did that affect Ashland?
Well,
Was it quick?
when it was opened, we weren't here. We had already left because we moved. Well, we were married here in April of 1954. We lived in.
58.
I'm sorry, 58. I graduated from high school in 54. College from 58. Married in 58. We lived in Richmond for 4 months or
And that's
something like that, and then moved
August.
to Arlington. And for a long time afterward, I-95 had not been built. And I can remember that when we would come and go, come to Randolph-Macon for something, come to visit Jim's parents, or go to Richmond to visit friends who lived there, on Route 1, it was a quick trip. I can remember driving it in an hour and a half flat, as little once as an hour and 15 minutes from Arlington to your parents' front door.
5 miles out of town.
And today, if we were to leave our house at 2 p.m. on a Friday afternoon to come down here, I'm guessing 5 to 6 hours.
You've taken us 5.
Yeah. It's really,
But
really
of course, Route
powerful.
1 then was mostly on each side woods. Woodbridge was a forest.
Mhm.
And you could just go on with examples.
And now, I just can't believe it when we occasionally get off of 95 for a reason to stop somewhere that's on Route 1. How densely populated it's becoming.
Over behind those trees. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, it's just incredible. And I really think that a time's going to come when we're just going to hit gridlock, when nothing will be moving between Richmond, or at least between Fredericksburg and Arlington.
Today,
You
we
won't be
didn't-
able to do it
We didn't take Shirley Highway. We went through Fairfax Courthouse, to
because
Occoquan, and got on 95.
because
And it took us 2 hours
395,
and
which
5
is
minutes
Shirley Highway, is,
to come
Yeah.
92 miles.
and we went through a really bad thunderstorm that
Yeah,
slowed
that
us down. But we would have been here less time than that. But it's terrible, absolutely
But
terrible.
95 at first was great. But
Yeah, but when they talk about evacuating Washington in the case of a national emergency, it's a joke. There is
and we
no
have
way
an
in the
example
world
of it,
you could
9/11.
get out of there.
We had neighbors that walked home from downtown Washington, and we're 7 miles from the White House. They couldn't get
There was
out.
no other way to get out. So,
Another question?
Yeah.
Just in terms of like world events or national events or just sort of big happenings. Of course, desegregation was a huge thing at the time that you were living here. What other big events do you remember affecting everyone, or big changes, or what are sort of the?
well, 9/11, of course, and then desegregation, I think, was more immediately followed by women's rights, and because it's just not my nature to battle or confront or fight people over issues. I'm always looking for a way to make things better, and that was why my introduction to to human resources and especially employee relations seemed to me the venue through which I could work for social change to benefit both minorities of all kinds. It started out with blacks and their rights, but now it's all minorities and women. I can remember after I was appointed to the Arlington Civil Service Commission. I worked very closely with the county board, the county manager, and the county's director of personnel, who's one of the best human resources people I ever knew. And Arlington, as I say, is very enlightened, very liberal. a lot of the people in major leadership positions in Arlington are women, but it was not always that way. And I can remember raising very cautiously the issue with the county's director of personnel on the fact that women were not being paid the same as men for doing the same job, the very same job. And he bristled a little bit, but I did it on neutral ground. I didn't do it in his office, but we invited him over to our house, and we had a cookout. Remember, we were out on the deck with Alan. Out on the deck with Alan. And I said, Alan, you know, I think we should continue to dialogue about equal pay for equal work, because it's a no-brainer. There are people who are doing exactly the same work side by side. You really cannot defend not paying them the same thing. And he bristled, and he said, well, we can't do that in Arlington. And I said, why is that, Alan? And he said, because we can't afford it. It would cost too much. And I said, Alan, that was the same argument that the South used to defend slavery. He didn't say another word. I could tell I had finally pierced his facade, and he was ready to go for it. And we did. And we cheered.
Okay. What about events in the town, such as parades? Did you attend any of them?
I can't honestly remember a parade ever in Ashland. Can you?
I remember as a freshman, I was in one with a small combo in the back of a truck playing saxophone. I don't remember what we played.
Homecoming parades.
Homecoming
at the
parades we'd
college.
see.
I remember going to them for all the years that you were in school. I guess they had them every year. Because I remember a friend of ours, Gwen Haley, being homecoming queen.
It seems to me parades, of course I haven't been here all year for 50 years, you know, long periods. But it seems like I read more about it in the paper, you know.
Yeah, I do too. We
And
thought
then
that
when we were coming along.
it seemed more like big city stuff to us.
Yeah.
I remember as the Tobacco Festival Princess being in that parade. It was a long parade all over Richmond. We all rode in on the backs of convertibles, and I don't remember any other parades.
I remember that one. I don't know what it was in conjunction with, maybe with homecoming or something.
What about the Strawberry Fair?
Never been. We just read about it in the paper. Looks like fun.
It's a relatively contemporary thing.
How do you feel about Ashland being coined the center of the universe?
All right.
Oh, that is so Dick Gillis. Yeah. Talking about colorful characters, I know the only one I mentioned was Miss Lily, who tried to remake me in her image. And
Would you
was
thank her for
something.
it, don't you?
Well, yes, I'm very grateful to Miss Lily, because my mother, you know, because of her clinical depression, she was sort of absent. You know, she was physically present, emotionally absent. And I really didn't have a mother. But I had an aunt in Richmond who was very fond of me. But because of the distance, I didn't see her frequently. And then I had an uncle who lived across Railroad Avenue, 1 block closer to town from us. And his wife was very dear to me. She was so good to me. And she understood. She never said anything, but I know now she understood what was going on in our house. And she was trying to make up for it. She was trying to be a mother to me. So I was grateful to Miss Lily because she taught me things that all girls need to know. Writing thank you notes. My mother never taught me anything, really. But she taught me about writing thank you notes and how to sit properly as a lady would sit, and how to dress properly. Because if I came downstairs to sit on her front porch, and she was always dressed up, every day. And if I came down to sit on her front porch and I was not properly dressed, she sent me back in. And I wouldn't say that any of this was done lovingly. She saw it as her role to set me straight, to remake me in her image. Because if I was going to live in her house, I was going to be a proper Southern lady.
Would you characterize her as that stereotypical Southern belle?
No, she wasn't nearly charming enough to be a Southern belle. No, she was an old maid, a
Okay.
Southern old maid. Very critical of almost everyone, for almost anything. Had no social life. I never knew anyone to come visit her in all the years we lived there. But as we pointed out earlier, her niece lived next door, and her niece's family. So they were very attentive to her, but I don't think they enjoyed her company very much.
What were you going to say about Dick?
I was going to say Dick Gillis is another person I should have mentioned,
The Son
along
of the Universe
with
question.
yes, along with Miss Lily as a colorful character.
Yeah.
Those are the main people I think of as being
Who was it
colorful.
recently that was giving us a hard time or kidding us about Ashland being the center of the universe? How can that be? That's the most ridiculous thing. And
I don't know. It was a kid.
and I think we said, well, you didn't know Dick Gillis. If you didn't know Dick Gillis, you could appreciate it.
because he sort of made it the center of the universe. Yeah. I don't know. Other than that,
Dick's one that married a local girl, too,
yes,
Shelton.
she was a teacher,
Teacher.
in the elementary school.
Yeah.
Hmm. But really good, kind people for the most part. I thought some of them used to look down their noses at me, but I think it was simply because almost everyone in Ashland had been born here and lived here their whole lives. And if someone new came to town, you sort of had to prove to them that you belonged here. I can remember, because my mother never left the house and my father was always at work, I was out doing things alone. I would ride my bike up and down the sidewalk or roller skate, or I'd walk up and buy ice cream at Hughes Drug Store or something, and I'd walk to church and Sunday school by myself. And women in the neighborhood, of course, were never employed. They were all full-time homemakers and mothers.
Unless they were old maids.
And some of them would stop me on the street when we first moved there. And I can just remember having this impression that they looked down at me, peering over their glasses, and say to me, who are you? And I would tell them my name, and then they would say, do I know your parents? And I would tell them my parents' names. And then they would look very troubled because none of those names meant anything to them. And they would say, where do you live, dear? And I would point to the house where I lived. Oh, you live with Miss Lily. Yes, ma'am, that's where I live. Oh, very interesting. And then the Inquisition was over and they would continue on their way. But I found it more amusing than anything else. And I remember my father. He had such a wonderful sense of humor. And all of this was very new to him. He had grown up in West Virginia, up along the banks of the Ohio River, lived on a family farm. And I remember he was so amused at some of the things here people would say. If someone was willing to give you a ride somewhere, they would say, I can carry you there. Is that all right? And that made my father have this mental image. He was a big man, tall, broad-shouldered, very strong, of this person who was smaller than he was, physically picking him up and carrying him someplace, and it would just crack him up. So we laughed, he and I laughed privately at home a lot about some of the Southern colloquialisms.
Kind of like turning off the light switch on the wall.
I don't
You
know that that's
turn it.
Southern, is it? You
Well,
switch the lights on and off, I guess. Some people say you cut them on and off.
Oh, yeah,
None
that's
of it
another
makes
one. What do
any
you do?
sense.
You cut the circuit.
Yeah. I can't-
Southerners, we think these things
I
through.
can't remember another example that he had of things he thought
We're
were
getting
so
away
fun.
from the
But he
accent.
never laughed at people for the way they
Oh, no.
talked. It's just that he had trouble making sense of some of the things that they said, because there were these expressions that were rooted right here in this culture that he had never heard before. What else?
Do you have any fond memories of any of the businesses?
Oh, yes. Hughes's drugstore. That's where we got our prescriptions when we needed any. And they served ice cream. And I do love ice cream. So I spent a lot of time there.
The limeade was good too.
And Mayberg's. I remember Mayberg's. But I wouldn't have remembered to say it to you if I hadn't seen it in your questions. Because it was a very old-fashioned store. It was like something that you would see in Dickens, with the glass front cases. You know, there was no self-service anything back there. You went into a store, you stood there and waited for someone
It's
to
kind of
offer
like my dad's store,
to
only
serve
small,
you.
larger.
Yes, the old hardwood cases with the glass fronts and tops and sides. And Mr. Mayberg, did his wife work in there too? I think she
Some,
did.
yeah.
And of course, we suspected that they were Jewish. And of course, you just did not encounter Jewish people in this part of the state. Well, I shouldn't say that, because there were
No, it's
Jews
not
in
true.
Richmond, Tall
Very
Homers and Barry
strong
Burks.
Jewish
and-
population.
Yeah, but not in Ashland. This was very much a Protestant Christian town.
Let a few
but,
Catholics in.
But Mr. Mayberg would help you, and he sold penny candy, which meant you could actually pick out several things for a penny, as I recall. And I don't even remember what else he had in there, because any time I went in there, it was for candy. And then there was D.B. Cox department store, which is where the Iron Horse is now. And then another one I remember, well, of course I remember Cross Brothers Grocery with great fondness, because I was so fond of Ivy Cross. She was a wonderful teacher to me in high school. And then when we got married, she took over all the duties that are usually assumed by the bride's mother, because my mother didn't do anything but show up. And the Variety Store, which is in a brick building at the opposite end of the
It's right
strip
next-
where Cross's Groceries.
It's right across the side street from
It says Company
the library.
Cars or something.
the library.
Across the side street directly from the library,
It's an ice cream
right?
shop.
And that was a variety store, kind of old-fashioned too, but I think there might have been some self-service there. But I worked in there for Christmas vacation my first year at Longwood, and Meade Jones, who owned and operated that business, was just the nicest man. He and his wife Laura, she later died, and he married someone else whose family I knew. But he was so kind to me. I didn't know anything about working in a store. I was utterly ignorant of what you do to work in a store like that, and he taught me, and I learned a lot from him. Not business skills. I learned a lot from him about how you deal with people in a commercial setting. So I remember all of those businesses. Also remember Barnes's drugstore, the banks. That was pretty much it, I think.
Wish I had some of those Roy Rogers and Gene Autry 2-shooters I got as a kid.
Oh,
Those are collector's items today.
One thing I do remember about working in Meade Jones Variety Store, because I just turned 17, at Christmas. By Christmas I was 17, and I was doing well at college, really enjoying it. Didn't feel as if I was in over my head. I was very comfortable with it. And one of the customers who came in while I was there was a girl named Sarah Mooney. and she had been in some of my high school classes, and she had dropped out. I don't know whether she dropped out because she was pregnant, but she got married, and she came in, and she had a toddler on each side of her, maybe a 3-year-old, and maybe could take care of himself, walk unassisted, and she was holding the hand of maybe a 2-year-old, and she was carrying a baby in her arms. And I looked at her, and she just looked utterly exhausted. And I knew she'd never finished high school, so had very little hope of ever being better off, really, than she was right then. And I looked at her, and I thought, oh, but for the grace of God. Because there was a time that we were students together in those classes, and now, lucky me, in college, having a great time. And here she is in that situation. So, that was one experience I had that sent me back to college studying even harder to make sure I would succeed in life. The other one was a summer that I worked, because my father would find me summer jobs. He found me a job at the end of my first year at the Division of Motor Vehicles in Richmond.
I was thinking about that.
Here I graduated with very high class standing in my high school, and I was already a Dean's List student in college. And my job for the summer, for 3 months, was to file cards that looked like index cards, but they were a little bit longer, and they had all of the information about the vehicles that had been registered. And they filed them 3 different ways, because if they needed to identify a vehicle, maybe it had been involved in an accident or had been stolen, it had to be filed under the owner's name, it had to be filed under the license plate number, and it had to be filed under the motor number. There's a number on the motor of every vehicle, or there was then. I spent 8 hours a day for 3 months, 5 days a week, filing cards in numerical order. It was so dull and so boring that more than once I fell asleep sitting on the stool, leaning on the file drawer. The only variation in the day is whether you sat because you were filing the lower level drawers, or whether you stood because you had to stand to file in the upper drawers. And the woman who was my supervisor was a really kind and sweet woman, but a very good supervisor, very focused on seeing that the work got done, that people who worked there met their goals for the number of cards they should file in a day, so they wouldn't fall behind. And she was not only the supervisor, but she was really more what you would call a lead worker, because she didn't supervise full time. Her supervisory duties were added on to her principal duty, which was filing cards all day long. And while I was there, we celebrated her 40th anniversary of working at the DMV filing cards. Believe me, when I went back to school that September, I studied as I never had when I saw how some people earn a living. First seeing Sarah, who would probably never really be employable, having dropped out of school, and then saw, I can't remember the woman's name, but she was so kind to me. And I looked at her and I thought, oh no, I don't ever want to be you in your position. I will make sure that never happens to you. And then the next summer, my job was working at the State Highway Department. I had no work to do. I was working in right-of-way acquisition, and I guess the budget didn't include enough money to do any new highway construction that summer. So I had nothing to do, literally nothing, and they were paying me every week to do nothing. But my supervisor said, this is very important, Anita. I am in charge of this entire unit, and I've been in charge of it for years. He said, we have no work this summer. But he said, I don't want the unit to be diminished in size because we aren't busy. So your job is to look busy all day, every day. Because he said at any moment the commissioner could stride in here, past your desk. My desk was right here. The door was here. My desk was here. I would be the first person he would see when he walked in. He said, if the commissioner walks in and sees that you are not working, or that anyone in this unit isn't working, then that's going to create a real problem for me. So stay busy. You have no idea how much work it is to try to stay busy.
What did you do to stay busy?
Fortunately for me, as an English major, the State Highway Department is connected by an underground library, an underground tunnel to the state library.
Mm-hmm.
Are you okay?
Just got a cramp. Go ahead.
So at lunchtime every day, I went over and checked books out at the state library that I needed to read for my program. I mean, they weren't assigned. I just needed to read everything written by Ernest Hemingway, everything written by O'Neill and other great writers. Bring them back in a briefcase.
Mm-hmm.
I'd put them in my desk drawer, the kind that pulls out right underneath the top of your desk. And on the top of my desk, it was covered with maps and plats and colored pencils for inking in the areas where the construction would begin, and a light on over all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I held the desk drawer out just far enough for me to read the book that was there, and I leaned forward as if I was getting ready to ink in some plats. And then, if the commissioner or anyone else walked in, I immediately shut my drawer and got up and walked over to the person sitting to the right of me to ask that person a question about that project.
Did the commissioner ever come in?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And my boss, who was sitting over there, he had a full-time stenographer.
Mm-hmm.
And his job was to send letters out to people whose property was being taken by the state by eminent domain in order to build highways through that property. So he dictated letters to his secretary to people whose property was going to be condemned. Only there weren't any property owners who needed to receive such letters. So all day long, he dictated the same letter to her over and over again. And she sat there and took it down in shorthand and read it back to him. He approved it. She went to her desk and typed it up and brought it back to him to sign. And that was when I knew I could never work for government at any
Mm-hmm.
level.
Do you have any questions, Lori?
Yeah, I think I just had one more, and it goes back to when you were talking about desegregation. We appreciate your candor, because many people have told us there was no race problem. You didn't go to school, of course, with black children. They didn't live in your neighborhood. Did you know people in the African American community, and how did you know them? Why did you know them?
Let me begin by saying, in case I sound self-righteous, I did not go to school with black children in West Virginia either, where I was born, because there weren't many. I won't say there weren't any. There were a few, and I can remember that when I walked to school every day, I walked past a one-room schoolhouse on my left that was for black children. Very small school. Very few children were enrolled there. Even if you walked past there during when they were on the playground having recess, you could see how few children there were. So there were no bad relations in the way that there are in communities like Alabama and Louisiana and Mississippi because there weren't enough black people there to represent a threat to the white minority. It was simply a non-issue. We had a colored woman, that's what they were called. You didn't say you have a maid or you have a servant, you have a colored woman who comes to your house and cleans. Well, because of my mother's depression, she never did much of anything at home. So we had a colored woman who came to our house, and she did all of our laundry, and she cleaned. My mother prepared meals, more or less, and served them. And that was it. But I had very little experience with black people in West Virginia. So the thing that was a revelation to me was seeing the numbers of them who were here. But even so, I didn't see many of them in the streets in Ashland. It was when I went to your house that I saw a lot of black people. And I saw how well they all got along, the white people and the black people.
Many of my dad's customers were black, and their children, of course, I knew. They were my age. We played together. Everything was equal except we didn't mix.
You played together. You just didn't go to school together.
Yeah. Clarence Ross, old gentleman that worked for my dad in the store, handyman type thing. My mother fixed meals for Clarence, but he would eat them at my dad's roll-top desk in the store, not in the house.
I can remember my father. I don't know, if you hadn't said that, I wouldn't remember this. But I can remember my father insisting that we not sit at the table with Catherine, who was the woman who came and cleaned and did laundry for us, when she was eating lunch. He thought that she should have lunch separately from us. She ate exactly the same thing we did, and she ate at the same table, but we didn't all sit down there together.
Yeah.
And I thought with him it was more a class issue than a race issue. That you shouldn't sit down and eat with your servants, because there should be a respectful difference between you. Although he said very little, I was just
But
drawing my
Clarence
own
Ross,
conclusion.
he and I were great buddies. His nickname was Dust Burner. And back then, a lot of blacks had nicknames, or you joked with them or kidded with them. I mean, we had Dust Burner Ross, we had Watch Burner Dabney, we had Bicycle Willie, we had Eddie Rake Leaves here in Ashland.
And
You
many
heard-
times you
you
didn't
heard
even
of-
know their last names.
you
It
heard
was
of
as if they
Eddie
didn't
Rake
have
Leaves.
last names.
Yes.
Yeah. Lived in a car. Snookums. You heard of Snookums? Used to treat Snookums awful. But he just keep coming back for more, laughed. I mean, I think Snookums was probably special. But pulled tricks on him. But there was a lot of laughter and a lot of kidding around. I never saw really anger or mistreatment physically.
I never did. My father had a lot of customers who were African American, and he got along with them just fine. I remember he came home from work one day terribly distressed because some man had been killed in an automobile accident. It was one of his customers,
Yeah.
and he was a black man.
Yeah.
And my father was very upset about that.
Well, I mentioned Watch Burner Dabney. He supposedly carried pocket watches. He wore the same clothes, winter and summer. Because he said, what keeps out the cold keeps out the heat. But my dad accused Henry, of ticking. Sounded like a bomb because of all those watches. But he'd go to Ashland, sit down at D.B. Cox's here, and trade watches with people. And my father accused him of burning, getting burned on a deal. And, oh, no, Miss Allen, no way, Miss Allen, I treat people right. But his mother, Aunt Aggie, and of course back then it was Uncle this and Aunt this when it came to blacks. Aunt Aggie Dabney lived to be 103, and she had served breakfast to Stonewall Jackson. I remember her. We're getting off the beaten
I was
path
going to
here.
say, yeah, we've digressed pretty far from
Digressed.
the subject, I think.
But it's all of, it's all history.
Anything else?
For my final question, what do you think makes Ashland so special?
It's interesting that we had this conversation with Sarah on our way back here, walking back from the Iron Horse, because I said to her, Ashland is really special to me. There is only one Ashland, and maybe that's what Dick Gillis meant when he proclaimed it the center of the universe. I have visited lots of southern towns. I visited lots of New England towns that remind me a lot of Ashland. So it isn't the weather or the climate. It isn't the cultural differences between, north, south, and that whole thing. I have to say that I think it is the presence of the college that makes Ashland special. I cannot imagine that Ashland would have had nearly the same appeal for me, or that I would have felt so satisfied to live here from, age 9 to when I finished college, just barely 20. I knew that I would never live the rest of my life here, because I wasn't born here, and I do believe then, it may not be the same now, that in Ashland you either belonged or you didn't belong, and if you weren't born here, you didn't belong. People would accept you, they'd treat you well, they wouldn't treat you any differently, but you just knew deep down that you were the only one who was different. And so I knew I would never stay here. But I guess if something happened and I had to leave Arlington, couldn't live there anymore, because I do love Arlington. It's a wonderful place to live, and we are so involved with our church there, and really our entire social circle, pretty much, except for a few neighbors and former co-workers, is the membership of our church. But if for some reason I can't even fathom I couldn't stay there, I might move back here. Because I think you always want to live in a place when you are aging where you feel comfortable and you know you have a history. So there are really only two places like that for me: Arlington and Ashland. Farmville, that was such
I
a
always
brief
thought it'd be nice to move
span
back
of
to
time.
college town. We thought about Charlottesville.
Yes, we did live in Charlottesville
for
for
a
a year while Jim was in graduate school, and we loved it. I remember when we moved back to Arlington, I said to him, I have never been homesick in my life, and I never understood what people meant by it when they said that. But I said, I am homesick for Charlottesville. I really, really missed it.
But now with 10 grandchildren, and 8 of them within an hour and a half to 5 minutes away from us, if we moved to Charlottesville, they'd all be away from us.
Yes, but remember, some of them are going to move pretty soon to Virginia Beach.
What was your question on this last question?
What do you think makes Ashland special?
And I had an answer for that, but I've forgotten what it was. Must not have been important.
It is unique. And I can remember many times saying to people that I believed that the highest quality of life was available in a town with a college. And I say town for a reason, because we live in Arlington and we do have Marymount University, we have a
George Mason.
UVA and a Virginia Tech extension, and we have
George Mason.
George Mason. It's mainly the law school, isn't it?
Yeah, but I'm thinking about in the immediate area. The
No, I'm talking about
university.
Arlington.
Oh,
But
Strayer College.
If I lived in Washington, it's such a big city, would I feel the presence of GW, Georgetown, AU, Catholic U, Howard U? I don't think so, not unless I were an alumna of one of those institutions. Now, and we've never wanted to live in D.C., but I do admit that the far northwest area of Washington, you know, Spring Valley and that whole area around AU is very much like living in Arlington as far as its appearance and the people who live there. But there's still reasons why I wouldn't live in Washington for any reason that override that. But yes, if you lived in Spring Valley, I can see how you would gravitate toward AU. They have a wonderful library, a beautiful art museum. You know, I wouldn't go to some of those other universities because if I wanted to go see basketball at night, I wouldn't venture into where their basketball arena is. But I would at AU. I mean, AU is in a safe part of the city, relatively.
How about back to Ashland? How about back to Ashland? Anything else makes this special to live?
Well, yeah, I think we've covered that.
Okay.
I'm just saying that that's one of the reasons it's special. Because a town with a college gives you the best of both worlds. We sort of have that where we are. Because we're close to so much that's available around us, and yet we live in a small town, sort of, the Westover village of Arlington. It's a lot like Ashland, and I think it's one reason why I love it. Okay.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. I probably told you a lot more than is useful, or more than you need to know. But it's better to have more information than you need than less.